untold resources. Japan had struck. Bombs rain on Darwin. A devastating raid shatters the town. Many hundreds died in that one onslaught. It's a heavy blow, and Darwin's defenders shut their teeth and await the anticipated Japanese landing. Midget submarines enter Sydney Harbour. Sydney and Newcastle shelled by submarines at night. Damage is slight. A few houses hit, but it brought the war close home.
Gentlemen, the truth is that if we do not strip ourselves to save our country, the enemy will do it for us, with ruthless efficiency, imposing upon us a maximum of misery.
When the war broke out, all that we knew about mustard gas was the information that was gathered in France and Europe in the First World War. There had been a little bit of research done in England and even less in Australia between the wars, but it was expected that chemical warfare would be used if another war started. The basic reason for that was the Japanese had used it in Manchuria against the Chinese, and the Italians had used it in Ethiopia against the Abyssinians. What made Australian research urgent was the fact that the Japanese took Singapore, and we realised that we would have to fight a war under tropical conditions virtually on our own back doorstep. Later, when we pushed the Japanese out of New Guinea, they left behind a 75mm shell that was filled with a mixture of mustard gas and lewisite. And it was the fact that we found this that convinced me and a number of other people that we were on the right track. Now that is the fuse holder off that shell. I probably shouldn't have it, and you probably shouldn't see it.
My husband Stan was a war correspondent and the official photographer for the chemical warfare unit, the one they said never existed. And often he would be covered with mustard gas. And he continued filming because he thought it was more important to finish the film than to look after himself. After the war, he had a continual terrible cough and wheeze. So one day he thought, oh, I'll just ask, do you think it could be to do with mustard gas? To which the doctor said, nice try, fella, but we all know there was no mustard gas used in World War II.
I first heard about chemical warfare indirectly. I was working in biochemistry at a Sydney hospital, and I received a rather obscure letter suggesting I come down for an interview to Melbourne. I went down and I found myself confronted with a Major Gorrell, a slight British or Cornish medico who had a science degree as well, who'd been sent out from England, I imagine on a request from the British forces, the Australian forces, to come out and train our medical officers in the treatment of gas casualties in case gas was to be used. After Gorrell had finished what he felt was an adequate laboratory test, he then decided we should go up north to Queensland. Our first stop was Townsville, so that he could see how everything worked under tropical conditions as near as possible to those which might be expected in the field.
When we started work on mustard gas in Queensland, The things that we did not know were just how effective it was under tropical conditions. The first trial, which happened in Townsville, they had a wooden box that a man could get up and walk around inside, and this was painted inside with a special paint that the English had told us was mustard gas resistant. When they put a known concentration of mustard gas in the chamber early in the morning and tried to analyse it, they couldn't find any at all. So certain people went in to have a look. By the time they got in, it was round about lunchtime, temperatures shot up, and the mustard gas, which had been adsorbed into this paint, had desorbed out of the paint, and they all got burned.
I got to the bungalow. There they were lying on the veranda, having difficulty in their breathing, their faces like great red footballs, their eyes bunged up. I think it was mainly in the second of our seasons, when we were at Innisfail, that we felt the full advantages of international cooperation. Gorrell had flown back to England and got another half dozen people from Porton, the British Chemical Warfare Establishment, and brought back as his second in command, Captain David Sinclair. He was made chief of the physiological work. And we also had visits from Captain Howard Skipper, a very amiable and highly skilled American biochemist and physiologist. We had also had to discard the old gas chamber completely, redesign and build a stainless steel gas chamber which behaved perfectly. The smallest amounts of mustard gas put up were not absorbed by the wall. It remained in the atmosphere. We were able to control the temperature and humidity of this enormous 100 cubic metre gas chamber and do experiments which were remarkably accurate.
I first heard about chemical warfare and going to work for them when I was in an anti-aircraft unit. I had to go and see Colonel Gorrell, and he explained what chemical warfare unit was and what they were going to do, and told me that I was going to work for them. And I said I didn't want to. I wanted to stay in anti-aircraft. And he said, well, I had two choices. I could come like a lady or I could be sent.
At the time that I went up north and joined the unit, I had absolutely no knowledge of what was going on, what the unit was doing, nothing. I started off in the war as AMWS, which means Australian Army Medical Women's Service, and I was 19 and really badly wanted to get into something that was exciting and adventurous. Even though I didn't know what it was, it had to be better than carting bedpans.
Sydney, and is the big parade of our wartime womanhood. Fine types they are, keen as mustard.
When we finally organised the unit and they got everything together, we were all sent up to Queensland by train. I found the train trip very interesting because I'd never been to Queensland before, and the country changed very dramatically.
The further north you went, the more beautiful it was. It was rather mind-boggling to we girls from the south. I think that the excitement of all this contrast with our southern states and the different life we were leading, it deadened or hid away from us the implications of the deadliness of what we were actually doing.
There is no way of finding out what damage mustard gas can do in the tropics except by using human volunteers. The initial letter going out calling for volunteers was, I think, a little obscure, simply mentioning experiments in the tropics. Well, the tropics always have a certain charm, and the grapevine told them that there were members of the Australian Women Army Service in the unit, as well as a lot of scientists.
It was no use doing these experiments on animals and then not be able to tell us what their reactions were. So I guess we had to have humans. Oddly enough, it never seemed strange to us. Perhaps because it was the sort of thing we'd have done ourselves. It just seemed to be something that could be done for the war. I suppose we didn't think enough about the fact that all the volunteers we got were 6th and 9th Division fellows who'd already done their bit, I suppose.
We'd just come back from Dutch New Guinea and we're been on leave, and we had to report back to Strathpine in North Queensland. And one morning they came around there. We were getting a bit sick of these route marches, so they asked for a gas, any volunteers for a gas school. So the mate and I, we looked at each other and we said, oh, well, we might learn something from this, so away we went. We thought it was only something to do with tear gas and that. When we got to the gas school there, they told us it was mustard gas, and we didn't know much about what it was or anything like that until we copped it. They said you can step out if you don't want to go through with it. Well, no one stepped out. Being Australians, we don't let your mates down and all this sort of business, and no one would fall out.
There was no information given about what we were going to do when we arrived at this experimental unit. The whole situation was a very hush-hush affair, in actual fact. There was nothing came through as far as I was concerned anyway. I knew nothing of it, and I was very much in the dark. The reason for volunteering was to assist the war effort because they had actually called for it, and they would not have called for it unless it was necessary. And I didn't anticipate anything going wrong anyway, because I had faith in our service areas. I'm afraid I didn't even think of my health. I didn't even think that we would suffer as much as we did.
Volunteers arrive at the station in batches of approximately 50 at a time. They are given a talk which explains to them the object of the experiments, and sweepstakes are often arranged, the winner, oddly enough, being the man who gets the worst burns.
Well, the first day we went into the gas chambers, they give us these camouflage uniforms, and some were all right. They're supposed to have been protective gearing, but they weren't protective gearing, I can assure you that. They were, the one I had on was torn in around the legs, both arms, and on the back and on the front. I thought it was something fishy going on then. And when we went into the gas chamber there was about five or six, I'm not quite sure, and a sergeant. And he put this gas cylinder on the floor and opened it up, and we let it go for, I suppose, about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour.
In the gas chamber itself, it was rather a hectic situation. When we went in, the object of the exercise was to pick up gunny sacks filled with sand from one corner of the chamber and carry it across to the other corner of the chamber. It was not long before we were covered in perspiration or actually sweat. This went through all our clothing. It picked up the gas that was in the air and clung to the uniforms. After a couple of hours, we really became very, very tired. This was sensed by the boys and the girls from the RAP areas.
When you had gas chamber duty, everybody took their turn at it. You would sing to them, or you would tell them funny stories, or even just poke faces at them just through the windows, just anything to keep them amused, because even though they did some physical labour in there, there were times when they were resting, and it must have been very boring for them.
The girls kept us going by singing songs of Australiana. In fact, I can still hear this track winding back coming through the PA.
Along the road to Gandhagay, where the blue gums are growing, the Murrumbidgee is flowing beneath clear summer skies, where my mommy and daddy are waiting for me, and the pals of my childhood once more will I see.
And just before we came out, they asked us to lift the sides of our gas masks, and then we just filed out. We had to go and sleep in our uniforms and everything.
Everywhere where the uniform was sweaty and collected this gas became completely sore and completely impregnated. The worst areas affected were obviously where the dampness was, and in between the crotch and up under the armpits and around the backs of the legs, where the actual sweat accumulated and carried the gas.
And the next day it started to come up in all little blisters, and from there on, day after day, they got bigger and bigger and bigger, until the fourth day they were just one big sheet of blisters. Well, I was burnt over. I reckon about 95% I was burnt all over, and all around me private and that. You could hardly walk in the finish. It was that bad.
I think the second thing we did at Innisfail was to build an assault course. There were climbs over great ladders and going across rope crossings, but there was a particular refinement. We built a sort of cage of liana vines, which every few days we went out to the jungle and got more vines, so that it was extremely hard for anyone to go through this cage of tangled vines and not rub their arms and shoulders in order to try and exacerbate the pain they were feeling from their burns.
Corporal Stevens, get a move on, you're dragging your feet. Sergeant Thompson, once more over to scaffold, and then on.
By that time, the bravery of the Japanese soldiers was well understood. Many might stay in a foxhole, injured almost unto death, and still have a grenade ready to throw at our people who came past. So it was explained that only by going to the limit of their own endurance with the burns could we even manage to equal the courage of the enemy they had to fight.
Unfortunately, perhaps fortunately, we had Australian volunteers who are extremely pig-headed, and they would go for ages, long after you thought it was possible for human beings to go. I don't know whether any other troops would have gone for quite as long as they did, because it seemed almost miraculous that some of them could keep going for as long as they did.
On one occasion, when we had some severely burned men, we were visited by some senior medical officers who'd come out from Britain. And I think one may even have been a general. And Gorrell spoke to the volunteers and asked them would they drop their pants and simply show how serious their injuries were. And they all said these men are casualties, they can't do anything, should be hospitalised. So Gorrell said, well, go ahead. So the men pulled up their pants and put on their webbing again, went over the assault course, marched away to camp afterwards.
Every morning we had to report to the doctor. He said to me after 2.5 weeks, Morris, why don't you give up? And I said, but you don't want me to give up, really. What you want to find out is the extent to which I would become a casualty in the case of a gas attack. He said, that's right. So I said, well, and my corporal with me agreed, we could go on. So at the end of the 3rd week, we decided, well, that we'd both had enough anyway. We were weeping blood, and so we said, that's enough.
In this case, the volunteer was in such pain after going over the first obstacle in the assault course that he was forced to give up. This meant that he had failed to complete the standard daily exercise, and he was therefore classed as partially disabled.
It was with great relief that we got out into that bed, eventually in the hospital.
Well, I got to about 3 parts up, and I just flaked right out and fell backwards on the ground, and they picked me up and took me put me in the stretcher and took me back to the top floor of the Innisfail Hospital. And we were up there. I suppose we were up there for nearly 3 weeks before we were able to get around properly. And the sister used to come around each day and be peeling off big sheets of skin, and it was just like red raw underneath, and you couldn't bear the sheets on you. You all slept on the nutty. Then we had this officer used to come around, a British officer, and he said, well done, lads. And sure enough, we were well done all right. We were like pieces of raw steak.
If a man retains enough use of his arms and eyes to allow him to fire a weapon, admission to hospital does not necessarily make him totally disabled. During his stay in hospital, which was necessitated solely because of the condition of the scrotum, this volunteer was classed as partially disabled. The hospital, particularly the mattress and sheets, was greatly appreciated by the volunteers, and some difficulty was often encountered in persuading them to leave.
As the trials became more advanced, Sinclair, the British scientist, considerably improved our recording methods. He designed a little mannequin, back and front on cards, in which we entered the serial number or some reference to the volunteer, together with the conditions of the exposure, temperature, concentration and dose. Each day we examined these men and sketched on the cards in red the areas where they had been burned in various degrees.
And I remember one particular time Mr. Legg had examined a boy that I was going out with. And he brought his card out and handed it to me and said, "Here, you'll have to behave yourself now." And I took one look at it and said to him, "My love is like a red rose." I thought that was rather funny, but the poor boy was probably suffering very badly, and it probably wasn't very funny at all for him.
We were a very close-knit community. We had to depend on each other, all of us, for our own fun, entertainment, and I dare say we depended on each other too for safety in what we were doing. I don't think really that we were aware of how really dangerous it was. I don't recall, thinking, my God, I've got to go out into that mustard gas and do what I've got to do. The Mission Beach trials were held early in February, and we had to get up very early and drive quite a long way down to the area that was to be bombed. When we got to the beach, we had to get out and position our instruments on the first line of the dunes. Then we had to get into our protective clothing with respirators and wade out as far as we could into the sea to be out of range of the mustard gas when it was discharged. And then we just waited until the bombers came over, and I can still see them as they flew around Dunk Island and headed for the beach, and then they discharged their load of evil-looking red liquid. One of the boys had vomited into his respirator, and we girls felt very smug because we didn't vomit into our respirators. We felt we were really a much tougher breed than the boys. And just felt sorry for the poor fellow. Could you imagine vomiting into a respirator and having to keep it on? We were told right from the beginning that there was to be absolutely no discussion anywhere outside about what we were doing, and my letters were censored very heavily.
We were continually put in a big hut and hammered with secrecy, and they used many different forms. Some fellows signed papers and everything, but the secrecy was a big thing about it.
My husband Stan was sent to make the Brook Island film. The film, when completed, was regarded as so secret that Stan had to process it all personally and to screen it for the big brass, the various officers and that, it had to be screened in our home. And to my surprise, they all arrived with soldiers with fixed bayonet all around the house so that no one could come into the house while it was being screened.
First off is Colonel Gorrell, now America's Colonel Rhodes and Britain's Mr. Pascal. A number of scientists from overseas were present at the trials: Colonel Coxburn of the United States Chemical Warfare Service, Mr. Weldon, Secretary of the Chemical Defence Board, Australia, Britain's Mr. Lanphier and others. A full parade was held, and here we have the men of the unit who volunteered to take part in the trial as human guinea pigs.
The experiment I was in was a rerun of Tarawa to use mustard gas and test the efficiency of that against the conventional bombardment, which wasn't very good. we had to build a site similar to a Jap defensive site, 12 different sites, and each one had a tunnel and a foxhole, and we had to take a goat up and tether it, and there was a Porton bubbler. It's a device that measures the concentration of gas. And the day the bombers came over, they came over, I think, about midday. When they came over, our job was to go up to our sites and turn on the bubblers. When the gas was dropped, we were well back out of the bomb line where the gas ran across the island. But we had to get up to the sites, and we had 10 minutes to turn the bubblers off. There was a bit of a rise on this hill, and we had to go up there in full anti-gas, and it was pretty slow going. We got on a Yank landing craft, and they took us back to the main Camp Island. It rained that night, and the next day, one of the fellows running the show called me over to his tent, and he said, "We had planned for you two fellows to go back in 3 days' time, but that rain last night will foul us up and it'll wash a bit of the gas away. We want you two men to go back now, 24 hours after the bombing, and spend 12 hours amongst the gas bombs." He said, "You'll just wear your jungle greens only." He said, "You can take a blanket, one blanket and a mosquito net, and we'll pick you up in the morning." We landed on the beach that day, and we had no protection whatsoever. No mask, no ointment, no nothing. And they told us to walk around the actual bomb strikes and don't rub on any of the bushes. Don't get any actual liquid mustard gas on you. But there was a terrible stench of the gas everywhere. So we went slowly up the rise, and we trying to dodge all these strikes. It's a very scrubby island, and there was mustard gas nearly everywhere. But we were particularly careful trying to keep it off our arms. We went up to where the bombs had dropped, and I put my net up, and I sat on my blanket all night in the gas. The goats were up and they were bleating and they were sick. A lot of them were in trouble. And we stayed there that night, and we must have got a lot of gas into our lungs over that night. After we got back to main island, I wasn't too good. They inspected me all over. They said, "Oh yes, you've got a few burns," but I think the main thing that got me was my lungs. Soon after that, I lost my voice completely. My voice went. Well, that gave me a bit of a fright. They didn't tell you much, and I didn't know how much damage had been done.
But after the mustard gas had been dropped, 2 American medical officers who'd been members of the original team refused to go on the island. And Gorrell was absolutely furious. He ordered them straight back to Papua New Guinea and told us afterwards that he rattled his gun, which he said they were lucky not to be shot for refusing to obey orders. And I've never forgotten. Here we've got American officers refusing to do what our volunteers or our women's army women were willing to do.
MacArthur was a bigwig out here, and he had to say of using a gas or not, and he badly wanted to use gas.
The use of toxic chemicals will be initiated only on the direct orders of the Commander-in-Chief, Southwest Pacific Area. When chemical warfare commences, the enemy will be attacked in maximum force.
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated. These proceedings are closed.
Trucks and took truckloads of them away to make things out of them. Signboards, and Lee had put the whole works together and paint it and write the name of the station on it. There's also one bloke got a sheep yard built out of them. That one won't sit quite straight, but there, he sits up straight now, and it'll take a fair-sized pot plant. You just sit him on it. It's quite handy, really, if you like pot plants.
I dropped out because my legs wouldn't carry me any further, and I couldn't go down as far as this ride. I never made it. Well, since I've been in the mustard gas, I can't go out into the sun. I'm out in the sun for about a quarter of an hour. I get burnt up and blister, and I've got the blood disease. And they told me that they can't do anything about it because the red corpals are eating the white corpals in the bloodstream.
My health has been poor for quite a long time. I've had a ischemic heart for about 15 years, and nervous condition, hypertension, skin cancer, and now for the last 3 years they've diagnosed me of having chronic leukemia. Another thing that made me sick about it was I started to learn about the poor deal fellas had got. A lot died after the war of lung cancer. The widows had put up with fellas who were half off their rocker and went alcoholic and everything, and the politicians told them that they were liars or they were psycho soldiers. It never occurred.
The volunteers had a lousy deal. They should have had some sort of compensation, and medical records should have been available to Veterans Affairs or Repatriation Department or whoever, because, as I said earlier, very few people knew about it. So if you went along to repat and said, look, I was burned with mustard gas in Queensland, they would say, ha, 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 wouldn't they? And they did to a lot of the boys too, I would gather.
The worst affected parts of the city showed no immediate signs of devastation, just normal domestic scenes. The family living here had fled to their cellar when they heard the first explosion. They would have been unaware that the lethal gases would penetrate every part of their home.
It's the poor country's neutron bomb. You've seen from the results in the Gulf War that a comprehensive chemical disarmament agreement is really necessary. So that there's a certain amount of irony in the fact that Australia is pushing chemical disarmament in Geneva and trying to hush up the fact that they had these trials 50 years ago.
I think it would have been given a certain strength to our moves for disarmament if the government had made efforts to make public much earlier the experiments we had been doing during the war. This is evidence that our Australian speakers in the United Nations will know what they're talking about. I sincerely hope that the present disarmament negotiations on destruction of chemical weapons and so on will be crowned with universal success, because everyone has to sign it and everyone has to be open to inspection.
Mustard gas, I believe a lot of them were. Terrible stuff. Bad enough to shoot one another, but to try and burn them to death slowly, that's what it did. It's terrible.